Welcome to Couch Catechism. I'm your host, Michael Obeid, and tonight we've got a very special guest, Daniel. How are you, Daniel?
Very good. How are you?
Thank you. Daniel, you're teaching at the moment at St Mary's Cathedral. I got Daniel on the show because he's a teacher, and we're going to be speaking about what topic tonight from the Catholic curriculum?
So I was actually involved in the writing team for a new course called Studies in Catholic Thought. So it's something that's replaced Catholic Studies. And the unit that we're going to be discussing tonight kind of crosses over into two, but predominantly we're looking at one called Virtue, Vice, and Salvation.
Awesome. Okay. And I understand that you have you were on the team that was implementing this program.
Yep.
And so it's very important that we do speak about virtues and vices. And so shout out to St Mary's Cathedral. So why are we speaking about this unit?
Look, I'll be honest with you. As a teacher, and you would have experienced this as well, I feel like this is a very important unit. It's something that I would always like to begin with because it's something that people have almost no concept of.
Okay.
And I think it's something that's very foundational. So once you grasp this, because as we know as Catholics, faith and reason work together. When you get the reason behind it, the faith complements it and it works perfectly.
And do you notice that, like, because we were speaking about this before, about like students within the class, are you noticing that like a lot of kids, there are a lot of foundational principles that they kind of just don't get and they need to kind of understand first before we can get into a lot of the deep stuff?
Absolutely. So it's funny you say that. It's a lot of students will ask me questions, and I know again this will happen to you a lot. Students will ask you a very, very complicated question about the gospel or about religion,
or about God even.
Something. Yeah. So why does God allow suffering to happen?
Yeah.
Okay. But then they have no foundational knowledge. They have no understanding of the natural law and how God operates. They have no knowledge of sacred scriptures, and it's almost like you have to start from the beginning in order to just answer the question.
Yeah.
But they expect an answer instantly. So it's like, I can give you the answer, but you won't understand it.
Yeah.
Because you're missing all the key parts. So it's just like someone saying to you, explain to me how the solar system works. I don't know what gravity is. I don't know how to count. I don't know how mathematics or physics works. Yeah. But come on, Mr. Obeid, explain it to me in 30 seconds how it works.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't.
And it wouldn't be doing it justice to the answer to explain it in like 10 or 20 seconds.
Exactly.
Which is what kids usually want.
Yeah.
And a lot of kids, I don't know whether you've been asked this question, but I always get asked the question from students, if God made everything, who made God? And we're going to be touching on Aristotle.
Absolutely.
And Aristotle but he was probably the primary innovator of the idea of the unmoved mover or the uncaused cause.
Yep.
And so students need to understand about Aristotelian metaphysics or causation in order for them to be able to understand the answer to this question. But there's so much that they need to understand first before they can even understand this.
Absolutely.
And I think they just don't realize that. So a very simple question like that just requires a lot of foundational principles that haven't even been addressed in the curriculum yet. But I actually like Studies of Catholic Thought because it's like we know that this is important for kids and we know that this is important for anyone. So it's important for them to teach it. But it would have been nice, or maybe they can, in future, they might be able to do something with the RE curriculum to be able to have some of these foundational concepts touched upon in the junior years first. Because it's almost like they're getting hit with everything in year 11.
Yeah, well, that's something that I've brought up, and I was actually, again, on a writing team drafting one of the
units?
Actually making amendments to the junior curriculum. So what we're actually doing is we're creating like a supplementary unit that goes alongside the units that you do from year 7 to 10 that actually introduce concepts. So when you get to year 11, you're like, whoa, what's Greek philosophy and Aristotle? It's like, well, we actually touched on that in year 8. Just very briefly, but introducing to those concepts.
So it's important for them to know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So anyway, let's get started. So tonight we're going to be speaking about virtues and vices. Okay, so that's one of the units. So can you just tell me, can you define for me what a virtue is? Okay,
so virtue comes from the Latin word virtus, and virtus means manliness. Okay, so it's a virtue or a virtus in the Roman concept was something that it's an excellence. It's something that you possess, and it's a habit that you possess, and it's an excellence of your character, drawn from the Greek arete. Virtue is when you are able to do something good and maintain it. And one thing that we learn from Aristotle is a virtue is not just something that you can do once, it's a habit. It's a habituation of something that's good. Okay. And then you have a virtue inside. You possess that virtue.
Okay. And this is something that makes the person a good person?
Yes. So when you are habitually a good person by doing virtuous actions, you become a good person.
And you become a virtuous person. Okay. Yep. And so the opposite of a virtue would be a vice.
A vice. So a vice is what we get the word vicious from. Also in the Latin would be sine, which means without. So it's almost like saying you are without virtue. That's what vice means. So a vice is when you have habituated something that's disordered. Okay, and obviously when we get into Aristotle, we'll be able to delve into that a little bit deeper. That's
interesting that you should say that, because when you say that the word vicious comes from the word sine, that's also that's in the Greek, is sine in the Latin.
In the Latin.
Say sine in the Latin, because I'm thinking of the Greek for sine as well. But what's interesting is that when a lot of people, they speak about, for example, good and bad or good and evil, they think of evil as a substance, when evil is actually the privation of a good.
Absolutely.
So like darkness isn't something created, it's like the absence of light.
Yep.
So when people understand that, they can understand how God can be perfectly good and doesn't create anything that's actually evil itself. So when it comes to virtue and vice, I'm thinking of darkness and light, good and evil as well. Absolutely. So vice is when a person lacks virtue.
Exactly.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's move on to the Greek philosophers now. Okay, so now with the Greek philosophers, there was an idea about virtues and vices well before Christianity came along. It started with the Greeks. So who do you want to touch upon first?
Okay, so very briefly, we'll probably look at, well, if you want to go really far back, and we'll just touch on this briefly, we have something called the Greek Pantheon. People will be very familiar with that. We think of things like Apollo, Zeus. Obviously, in the Roman version, we have Jupiter. It's this idea that every man understands that there is a higher power. Okay?
Yeah.
Every man understands there's something supernatural about the earth. And even St. Thomas Aquinas, when we speak about him, says God's existence is manifest through creation. So the idea is, even the ancient Greeks, who were pagans at this time, they have a concept that there is a supreme being. But what they do is they actually develop gods in their own image. And that's what St. Paul talks about in Romans when he said, because they were removed from God, they developed their own gods that were made in their image. So it's like an inversion of Genesis. We're made in God's image, and they made gods in their image. So they have a god of war. They have a god of, earthquakes. They have a god of the sea. So what you get is someone around the time of the 6th century BC, I believe it is. You get people like Thales and Heraclitus. They start saying, you know what? If God is supposed to be good, or we believe in things like justice, because justice and democracy was something that was really big in Athens at the time. Zeus isn't very just. Because when you really look at it, when you read the Iliad, when you read these ancient texts, the histories, Zeus isn't very just. He just randomly, at a whim, just like wipes out a whole city.
Okay.
And you have these gods fighting each other. How does that work? How is the order of the universe seen in gods if our own God that we worship isn't actually manifesting that?
Okay.
So what we can do is, maybe there's a different God. Maybe there's something like a supreme unknown God, and we get the word like the Logos, the Logos, this idea of there's this prime mover, there's this unknown God who is greater than Zeus, who's greater than all these other gods. And that's where the idea starts coming in. Okay?
And where does it get perfected amongst the Greek thinkers? Like who is probably one of the first? Because I think Socrates was a very intelligent man that lived in Athens, and he was questioning a lot of the ideas about these gods, and he realized that when you have a look at things like qualities of what it means to be a god. So for example, omnipotence would be one of them, to be all-powerful. But to be all-powerful means that you can't have two all-powerful beings.
Exactly.
So when Socrates was questioning the idea of these gods having these qualities, and he came to the realization that you can't have two people with the same qualities, the people in Athens were like, you're corrupting us. This is something that we've never thought about before. And I think it ended up getting Socrates killed, I think, in the end.
Yeah, so what happened was he was actually executed on, or sentenced to death on charges of impiety, meaning that he did not show honor and reverence to the gods. So he was actually sentenced to death, and he was asked to either renounce his beliefs or to drink hemlock, which was basically like a poison. And he said that he would rather die. And that's where you get this development of the philosopher. It's with Socrates, because again, he was saying, your pantheon makes no sense. justice, prudence, virtue, all these things your gods lack. So how can you worship them when you claim to be at the same time a society that thrives on these virtues?
On justice and democracy and so on and so forth.
So then we get someone called Plato. So Plato is the student of Socrates. Socrates didn't write anything down.
Yep.
Plato starts talking about things like the forms. And he starts talking about this idea that, okay, there's like goodness and there's these sort of virtues, but we can't ever have them. They're like this abstract concept, and we can try to understand them, but ultimately they're detached from us.
Well, with the theory of forms, for example, with Plato, for example, he said that this theory of forms existed within the abstract. It was kind of like within this third realm.
Yep.
But this idea of forms is like when you look at a triangle, for example, a triangle as we know it, he said, okay, well, let's look at a triangle. Because at this time, a lot of the philosophers before him, some of them believed only in reality. They were kind of like materialists. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at triangularity or triangles, he said, okay, a triangle is what? Made up of three sides. Okay? And it doesn't matter how you draw a triangle, whether it's chalk, whether it's red, whether it's blue, it's always going to be a triangle. But this triangle, what makes it a triangle? It's the qualities. Three sides straight, 180 degrees, sum of a triangle. Okay? But this concept existed, or in reality, even before triangles are drawn. And so if no one ever drew a triangle, would the concept or the idea of a triangle still be there? And he saw that as the essence or the form of something. And so when you look, you can actually, when you think about the idea of forms, you can even think about a couch. What makes a couch and not, like, for example, a sofa or an L-shaped lounge? Okay, it's because of the shape, the form. Okay, what is the form of a cup? That makes it different from the form of a bowl. Okay, but these concepts, because we're human beings and we're rational animals, we're able to look at cups and we're able to look at the forms of things and we're able to abstract them. And it's interesting because I was reading a book on it was more on scholastic metaphysics and
Edward Fesser?
No, not Edward Fesser, Cardinal Mercier, actually.
Okay.
And what's interesting, and students will actually like this, what students, when a lot, you know how students, they think that, do you ever get asked the question, do animals go to heaven?
Always.
Okay. Don't animals have like rational souls because they can cry and dream and things like that? And they can't really distinguish what's the main difference between a human person and an animal. And so one example that I always use is that we can understand about the concept or the form of things. We can, because if we look at triangles or the form of a triangle or the form of a cup or so on and so forth, when we abstract those concepts, we can apply them within our mind, and we would be able to look at anything that resembles a triangle and we'll say that's a triangle. Okay. Now, this example, when it comes to animals can't do that. And how can we prove that? Let's say, for example, you've got a man that he washes his car, and when he washes his car, he uses a rag, okay, to dry his car. But the rag that he uses is in the garage, and he teaches his dog to fetch a rag or a towel to come and to dry his car whenever he needs to dry it after he washes it. So whenever he teaches his dog knows that whenever he's going to go wash his car and he wants to dry it, he teaches him to go to the garage to fetch a towel to come and dry it. Now, let's say, for example, a towel's not available, and the man says to the dog, go fetch me a towel, all right, or go fetch me the towel. If the towel's not there, but something else is there, like let's say, for example, a chamois or something foam that is still able to dry the car, the dog is not able to register that. It's not able to rationalize or to pull out that universal concept of dryness, and the dog will not be able to understand that foam is still able to dry the car, and it won't be able to fetch it. Absolutely. So it's funny that animals actually can't do that. All right. So Plato understood that there's this world of forms that we understand that actually really exists. Okay. And, that exists within a third realm. So materialists or people that only believe in things that you can see with your senses, this kind of goes against that. So what were you saying? Like when it comes to, so you got Plato, for example, he had his theory of forms, and with a theory of forms, you can draw out the goodness of things as well.
That's right. So you can perfect the form of a human person, but ultimately, when it comes to Plato, he believes the perfection of humanity lies in knowledge. So in a way, he gives rise to this Gnostic element of Christianity that you can almost know things. You can be good just by knowledge of what's good. However, when we get to when we get to Aristotle, who St. Thomas Aquinas calls the philosopher, because we believe he is the best of all philosophers, is he has a more practical view of philosophy.
Okay.
So if you've ever seen that image of the School of Athens, which I believe is by Raffaello, it's in the Vatican, there's all the philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome. And right in the center, you have Plato and Aristotle. Plato is always pointing up and he's holding the Timaeus.
Yeah.
And Aristotle's on the Nicomachean Ethics and he's pointing to the ground.
Okay.
Because Plato is always concerned with mystery and forms, whereas Aristotle's saying, no, it's about what's here. It's very real.
Okay.
And what I would say is one of the problems with modern philosophy and modern man is they've lost that connection to realism because they've ultimately, what the Enlightenment thinkers did was they rejected Aristotelian principles through St. Thomas Aquinas.
Okay.
So everything becomes mysterious again. Everything's relative. Everything's about some internal phenomenon, which doesn't actually relate to reality. And a lot of problems stem from that, which we know in our current context.
And you know what? That's true, because students will understand this, because even when as soon as a person says, and you say to them, God exists, God's real, the teachings of the church are real. As soon as a student goes and says, I'm going to form my own opinion based upon that, or I'm going to form an opinion based upon my own judgment, they're applying these philosophies, because that's what rationalism is. Rationalism is that whatever the person can rationalize within himself, that becomes the objective truth. And relativism also kind of plays along that as well. It's like, yeah, that might be true for you, but that's not true for me. So then truth gets thrown out the window as well.
That's a form of immanentism. That's the belief that you are the principle of judgment. All reality is based on your view of reality.
Yeah.
Which is a erroneous way to look at the world, because there's many things that I don't understand about the world.
That's right.
But I can't be the principle of judgment on those things. There has to be some sort of higher power, some sort of order that brings reality to existence. And what your job to do is, as Aristotle would say, would be to conform yourself to reality, and that is called truth.
Okay, awesome. So now let's get really into Aristotle.
Yeah.
Okay, so because we're looking at virtues and vices, tell us about what Aristotle understood with regards to virtues and vices.
So Aristotle develops he develops a lot of things, but the three things I really want to talk about are the golden mean, his view on the four causes, and also his the four cardinal virtues.
Okay, so the first thing that we're going to be speaking about, did you want to talk about the golden mean first?
Yes. So we'll actually move to the four cardinal virtues.
Okay, so to start things off, we're going to talk about the four cardinal virtues. Go for it.
Okay, so the four cardinal virtues, according to Aristotle, were prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. So the first one is prudence. So what Aristotle says is, in order to be a good person, you must have all four of these virtues. If you don't, ultimately you're disordered. Because things like justice, for example, there are sub-virtues that fall under that.
Yep.
So every virtue that you can possibly have, ultimately are under these cardinal virtues, because cardinal relates to the top.
Yep.
Okay? So what he's saying when it comes to something like prudence is the ability to know the means to the end. You know, based on your situation, what's going on, how can I achieve a good? You're able to rationalize what you need to do.
Yeah, and it's like when you look at all your options, it's being able to look at all your options and choosing the best possible one.
Exactly, and one that confirms with virtue at the same time in the good.
Yeah.
The second one would be justice. So justice, Aristotle would say, is to render every man his right, or what is due to him. Mm-hmm. That means that, for example, if I borrow $100 from you, justice demands that I pay you $100, not $99, not $101.
Yep.
I have to render you every man his due. Okay? The third one would be fortitude. That is the ability to endure.
Yep.
So obviously life is hard, there's suffering in life.
Yep.
Aristotle would say that's part of life. What you need to do as a human being in order to have virtue is you need to have the ability to endure that.
Yeah.
When sufferings happen to you, and this is something that's picked up by Augustine, when sufferings happen to you, one of the principal means to be a good person is to be able to have that endurance. And even Jesus Christ says in the Gospels, he who perseveres until the end will be saved.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that Aristotle is big on.
Okay, awesome.
And the final one would be Temperance.
Temperance.
So temperance is essentially moderation. You know how to choose. You essentially have self-control. You never go to either extreme.
Yep.
And this is something, the reason why I left that for last is because then that builds perfectly into the golden mean.
Okay.
So what Aristotle says is, in order to be a virtuous person, you must be in the golden mean.
Yep.
Because virtue is not to have, virtue is in the middle.
Yep.
To have excess is a vice, and to have defect is a vice.
Yep.
So you think about something like bravery.
Yep.
Okay? People would say, oh, bravery is never being scared, or bravery is to always just, go forward.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. Okay, so what bravery is I guess in my own words, would be the ability to, it would be a kind of fortitude, it's the ability to meet the difficult.
Yep.
Okay? Or its ability to stand up, to stand in the face of danger.
Yep.
If you take that virtue as a defect and you don't have bravery, for example, or strength, or however you want to define it, because he uses different words, if you have a defect of that, you don't have enough, what you have is cowardice.
Yep.
That's bad. That's a vice. However, if you have too much bravery, you're actually reckless, which is also a vice. So what you have to do, by having prudence, in what situation, how much bravery do I need in this situation? Okay, sometimes relative to your situation and your state in life, you might need a little bit more. For example, you can make the argument that a soldier, for example, or a police officer, they kind of need to have an increase of bravery because their state of life demands it.
Yep.
Whereas someone, for example, a librarian, okay, if I can just use an example like that, they wouldn't have to have as much. Mm-hmm. So it's all relative.
Depending upon their state in life.
It depends on your state in life.
So it's almost like also a person having the intelligence and the wisdom to be able to pick his battles.
Exactly.
Okay.
So there's I believe he comes up with 64 or 68. I think it's 64 virtues that you must have. And he goes down the list and he shows you too much and excess is a vice, and if you have not enough is a defect, and that's also a vice.
That's also a
so
vice.
you have to find the middle.
So it's about finding the balance. It's like it's not tipping the scale on either end.
Yeah.
So it's finding that golden mean.
Exactly.
Okay. So you've spoken. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on there?
So. Not necessarily. If we move on to the four causes.
Yep.
Okay, so we've already looked at the four virtues.
Yep.
Okay. We've also looked at the golden mean, and the last one obviously would be the four causes. So what Aristotle believed and what he taught is everything on earth has four causes. The first cause is obviously the material cause. Okay.
So did you want to use an example straight away, or did you want to just speak about four causes and then we'll use an example?
This couch, for example.
Yep.
The material cause of this couch, hypothetically, we'll just say it's made of wood and
cushions and
cushions.
Wool and,
Okay, that's the material. That's what it's made from.
Yep.
Okay. The next cause that we have would be the formal cause.
Yep.
What form does it take? Why is this a couch and not a cushion? Why is this not a bed? It doesn't have the form of a bed.
Yep.
And that's what you were talking about earlier.
With Plato. And Aristotle, because he was a disciple or a student of Plato, this is something that he took from Plato, I'm guessing. So
Yes.
this idea about the form or the formality of the cause or the form.
Yep.
And so keep going. So that's the form.
So that's what separates this from a bed or a cushion, for example.
Okay.
Then we get to the next cause, is the efficient cause. The efficient cause is the thing that brings that thing
Together.
Yep. So the person who
made it,
actually built this couch, is the efficient cause of this couch.
Yep.
The final cause is called the final cause. The fourth cause is the final cause. What is the purpose of this couch? What is the purpose of this object? The purpose of this is to be something to be sat on and to be comfortable.
Okay.
That is its purpose.
Yep.
Aristotle would say, if this couch does not reach that final cause and is not comfortable and cannot be sit on, it's a bad couch.
Okay.
And that applies to everything. It applies to a house. The final cause of a house would be for people to live in securely.
Yep.
And to shelter them from the elements, for example.
Yep.
If it doesn't have that, it's not a good house.
Yep.
So Aristotle says, what are the four causes of a human person?
Okay.
And what is the final cause of a human person?
Okay.
The final cause of the human person, according to Aristotle, is to be virtuous. So he would then argue, if you are not virtuous, you are actually not living in conformity to what you were created for. Therefore, you are a disordered or a bad person because you are not living up to what is necessary.
Interesting. So the end is the telos.
Yep.
And it's the end to which every person is directed to. And so when you're talking about the four causes and you're speaking about this final end, that also relates to human actions, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So when you're speaking about virtues and vices, everything that a person does, they do it for a reason They do it for an end. And if that end is not good, then that person's action is not good. If that person's actions is not good, then that becomes vicious. And then in Catholic theology, we would say that that would become sinful.
Exactly, because you're deviating or you're habituating a vice and you're becoming disordered. If I just back up for a second, there's one thing that I missed with Plato, is this idea. He developed something called the Tripartite Soul. Okay. So according to Plato, he would say every human person has like three elements to them. Okay, there is the intellect, there is the will, and there are the appetites or the passions. But I believe he uses the word appetites.
Does he, just to cut you off there, he understood about the soul?
Yes.
Yeah, and so he would say that these are the faculties of a soul?
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Yep.
So the purpose of a human being, so if we pair up what I just said with Aristotle and Plato, the idea is a good person or an ordered person or a virtuous person is a person where the mind, the intellect informs the will, and the will informs the appetites.
Yep.
So an ordered person or a good person or a virtuous person is someone who recognizes the truth, recognizes what is good, and they attain that end.
Yep.
And their will, which is like their desire, their drive, they conform their will to the intellect and they say, this is a good thing, I will do it.
Yep. And then they desire it.
And they desire it, and they do it, and they habituate good virtues.
Yep.
Whereas someone who works with the appetites, so the appetites, that's something that we share with animals, for example, the desire to eat,
the passions,
sleep, things like that.
So when we're thinking of appetites, digestive appetites is something, but it's not exactly what we mean by appetites.
No.
So the appetites and emotions could be like even the ability to reproduce or to have sex would be part of the appetites.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tiredness, things that affect even animals, the idea for safety and the need to drink water. These are appetites.
Awesome.
Or entertainment, for example.
Yep.
So what Plato would say, and this is something that he really critiqued in Athenian society, he said that the problem with society, the problem with man in his time, he was saying that people had actually inverted that order. Okay. The proper order is for the intellect to inform the will, and the appetites, you subjugate them.
Okay.
You teach them, for example, for a student, I'm tired, I don't want to study. The intellect knows I have a test tomorrow, no study. So the will conforms to the intellect and says, you must study.
Yep.
Don't, for example, go to sleep.
Yep.
Don't waste time.
Yep.
What we've actually done in modern societies, we've actually inverted that. We've taught people that, you know what, whatever your appetites desire, that's what you attain.
Yeah.
So by flipping that order, Aristotle, Plato, and all the scholastics would actually argue you are actually cultivating a disordered generation and disordered temperament.
And if laws get passed based upon that reverse model, then ultimately that leads to a disordered society as well.
Absolutely, because when we really look at it, when we look at culture, a society or a culture, for example, a cultus is a way of worship, it's a way to operate, it's a way a group of people act.
Yep.
So what he would say is, just like you are an individual, you have a particular behavior, a society's culture is the collective behavior of everyone. Mm-hmm. So that's what Aristotle and Plato would say. So what we've actually done in our modern age, unfortunately, is because we've inverted that and we've lost track of this Aristotelian principle about reality and virtue.
Yep.
What we've actually done is we've actually inverted it and created a disordered society.
Wow, that's very interesting. So now what we're going to be doing, Daniel, is we're going to be speaking about the Christian thinkers. Okay, so who do you want to start with?
Obviously, St. Paul.
Okay, St. Paul. Okay, so tell me about St. Paul with regards to virtues and vices.
So what we always have to understand is St. Paul is a Roman citizen and he's a Pharisee. So what he does, he actually really combines the two worlds together. So St. Paul is very well versed in the Old Testament. He's a zealous practicing Pharisee, of practicing Jew at his time, which he even says in the gospel, no one outdoes me in zeal for the faith of my fathers. And he has the Roman citizenship. So even though he lives in Tarsus and his father's a tent maker, he also has this skill in oratory and he's familiar with Greco-Roman concepts. So when St. Paul actually goes and starts, he moves to the Greeks and he starts converting them, he starts using their own language and their philosophy against them.
Okay.
So what he actually does is, one of the main things he does, he starts saying that the Logos you've been talking about, that Thales and Heraclitus have been talking about, that Plato and Aristotle have been alluding to, Jesus Christ is that Logos. And the Latin word for that is verbum, or the word. And that's why we say in the Angelus, et verbo caro factum est et habitavit in nobis, that the word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. So things like that, when the Greeks hear that and the Romans hear that, it starts clicking for them.
Because they always understood about this concept of reason, because even the ancient Greek philosophers, like for example Plato, thought that the end or the telos of a person was knowledge.
Exactly.
For this reason.
Exactly.
Okay, which is the reason why you said kind of like he pointed up in that fresco. So St. Paul is telling them that this reason is an actual person.
Exactly.
When he speaks about God. And even when St. Paul goes to, I can't remember the
he goes
the
to
place,
the Parthenon.
The Parthenon, I think it was. He says, do you know this unknown God whom, because I think it was Socrates who spoke about this unknown God, because when he finally riddled the Athenian community and he showed them that there couldn't be two omnipotent gods or two gods that knew everything, there had to be just one. He made like a statue of a seat to the unknown God with an inscription underneath, but there was nobody that sat on it.
Exactly.
And so Socrates believed in this unknown God, and he pretty much almost sacrificed his life to that God. And I remember, because I used to read about a Greek philosopher by the name of Peter Kraft. If anyone wants to look him up, he believes that kind of Socrates, if he ended up in, he's got a dialogue or a book called Socrates Meets Jesus. And it's a nice, interesting dialogue where Socrates dies. He goes to Harvard Divinity School. He ends up meeting Jesus and he questions him. And because our Lord is the eternal Logos, he kind of like turns a lot of the questions, inverts them back on him, and it makes him come to the realization that Jesus is the Logos. He's the unknown God to whom he was preaching about.
Absolutely.
And so St. Paul goes and he says, I'm here. Do you know this unknown God whom you worship? I come to tell you who this unknown God is.
Absolutely.
And it is Jesus Christ.
Absolutely.
Yeah, keep going.
So this is where you actually get this connection between the tripartite soul of Plato and St. Paul, or the Christian theology.
Yeah.
So one thing that people would say is, for example, the Trinity is not biblical, for example, or it doesn't say Trinity in the Bible. However, it actually does. If you read things like Psalms, for example, the Psalms talk about, I believe it's Psalm 36, where it talks about the Lord spoke his word, and out of that, in the breath of his mouth, sanctified and created the earth. And the way it talks about the Lord, the word, and the breath, it's actually personified. So it actually has personhood. So it talks about this triunity. And there's this idea that the verbum, or the logos that the Greeks are thinking about, even in Jewish theology in the Old Testament, there's something called the Dabar Elohim, or the Dabar Adonai, which is the word of God.
Yep.
So that is what St. Paul, again, is saying. Jesus Christ is this word of God incarnate, made flesh. And so when he goes to the Greeks and uses their philosophy, he's able to convert the Roman Empire, and eventually that's why the Roman Empire becomes Catholic.
Okay, so to stop you there, so let me ask you a question then. So are you saying that if it wasn't for the Greek philosophers, or just let me reword that again, Plato and Aristotle pretty much laid the foundation stones, okay, when they were teaching the Greeks about this idea of forms and this idea of reality and uncaused causes and so forth, they were paving the way for St. Paul to have such great success in Athens. Is that right?
Absolutely. So that, I guess you could say, is part of God's divine providence.
Awesome.
So what we actually see is St. Augustine, who we're going to get to soon. St. Augustine says that just like the ancient Jews, when they leave Egypt, they take their vestments of their high priest with them to Israel to worship God with the beauty of their vestments, but directed towards the true God.
Yep.
That is what Augustine says St. Paul did with the philosophies of the Greeks and the Romans. He took what was good from them and used it to manifest God's glory on earth. Because what we need to understand, again, you're a maths teacher.
Yep.
Okay, so before, when you get to advanced maths and you start doing extension maths, and we're looking at Cartesian lines and we're looking at physics and things like that, or extension, kids need to know how to count first.
Yep.
They need to know the basics. They need to know the fundamentals. Without sounding, without saying rude or anything, you would say that the theology of the Old Testament is very superficial in a way. Okay, because it's foreshadowing what's going to happen in the New Testament. So the Jews have this concept that, if you're good, God will reward you. You'll have many kids, you'll be wealthy,
you'll be blessed,
you have money, etc. If you're bad, you get cursed, you get leprosy.
Your wife will be barren, you won't have any kids.
And you'll die.
And you'll end up in Sheol.
But then when we get to like the book of Job, and we get to the wisdom books, we start saying, you know what, that's not actually how God works. We start seeing this development of doctrine, this authentic development of doctrine, where it's like sometimes God allows suffering to inflict those whom he loves in order to perfect them.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the development that's happening, and this is what St. Paul is drawing on. He's connecting both of them together. So he's taking what's true, the natural truth of the Greeks and the Romans, well, predominantly the Greeks at this time, and he's saying that is correct. That is correct. This theory that you have from Aristotle, that is correct. This is correct because it all comes from God. Ultimately, all knowledge comes from God,
and all truth comes from God.
Exactly. So he's saying that is correct, and now let me infuse that with grace and supernatural virtue that only Christ can give you.
Awesome.
Because one thing we see is the heresy of the Pelagians, and this is something that's really big today. People think through their own merit and through their own actions they can merit salvation.
Yeah.
Natural ends cannot merit natural means cannot merit supernatural ends. Only supernatural means. So that's something that St. Paul says to the Romans. You can't get salvation. You need Jesus Christ. You need baptism. So what something I've been actually reading into when you read Josephus or even Theodoret and some of these really early Christian writers, what they actually say is there's a theory that's going around in academia is actually that if you read the book of wisdom and you look at the book of Kings, it actually says that a lot of the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, the Persians, these people actually start coming to Solomon for his wisdom. And what the theory that Josephus puts forward is the wisdom that the Greeks actually have was what they borrowed from Solomon in the Old Testament. Without supernatural revelation, and that's how they developed their Greco-Roman tradition. And then St. Paul is just meeting them up to where they are.
Wow, that's very interesting. Because I think a lot of the audience don't know, and that's probably important because if they didn't even know the story about Solomon, they probably wouldn't understand how interesting this story actually, his story goes. Because Solomon, with his, he was praying, I think, to God.
He offered like unbelievable sacrifices to God, like 1,000 rams.
And Solomon also, the reason why God rewarded him with wisdom was because God asked him, he goes, what is it that you desire? What is it that you want? And Solomon said, I just want wisdom to be able to judge my people rightly.
Absolutely.
And then God said to Solomon, because you have asked for this, something good, something just, and you haven't asked for riches, honor, wealth, and that, he goes, I'm going to make you wiser, more wiser than any man has ever lived. And then that all comes out in that story with the two women that came with the baby. And then Solomon said, and they both came claiming that the baby was theirs. And then when he said, okay, bring me a sword and I'll divide the baby in half and I'll give it to both of you. And then one of the women said, yeah, go and do it. And then the other woman said, no, give it to her. And he said, I've judged that you are the woman, that you are the true mother because you wouldn't want to have your baby killed. Take the other one off and do whatever. So Solomon had this wisdom, and you're saying that he gave it to the Greeks.
That's one of the theories that's positive. And that's something that I would agree with.
That's very interesting.
Because even you would see, even with Greek architecture, everyone knows for the Greek architecture, you have these beautiful columns and they kind of come out like a lotus and they're beautiful. When I was actually reading the book of Kings and Chronicles, when you actually read how the temple of Solomon is designed with the columns and the pomegranates, it actually is the same design. So a lot of people would argue, and this is just historically speaking, that a lot of the architecture and theology from ancient Greece and Rome comes from the east.
Comes from Solomon.
I would say it actually comes from the Solomon's Israel.
And maybe one of the seven wonders, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon as well, probably came from him as well, because that is still, I don't think they have an idea of how they designed them. Okay, so we've spoken about St. Paul. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on with St. Paul, or do you want to move on to Augustine now?
The one thing I would say in regards to St. Paul is, so the last thing that St. Paul kind of develops is this idea when we look at Plato and how he said there's an intellect, there's a will, and there are appetites. That's how the human person functions. But you wouldn't say, Michael, you have an intellect, you have a will, you have an appetite. You're three people. No, you're one person because there's a unity between all three. What St. Paul starts saying to the Greeks and the Romans is God is triune because God is omnipotent. He has, I guess you could say, this is obviously
intellect.
Every analogy about the Trinity is always, within subpar. Nature. But this is what I'm trying to say is the Father is kind of like the intellect. The Spirit is kind of the will, the drive. The Holy Spirit. And because God doesn't have appetites because he's not a creature, he's pure potency, as Plato would say. All he has is pure act, and that act is the word. So that is how St. Paul kind of explains the Trinity to the ancient Greeks and the Romans. The idea there's a unicity, there's a unity between the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, just like there's a unity between the intellect, the will, and the word, all in one.
Okay.
And you would say there is one God, or there's three distinct parts, just like you have an intellect, a will, and appetites, but you're one person with three distinct parts.
Awesome, yeah. And when we get into Aquinas, we'll probably get into what he says about the Trinity as well. So, okay, so we've spoken about St. Paul. Now we're going to be speaking about a bit about St. Augustine. Did you want to speak about?
Yep.
Okay, go for it. So with St. Augustine, Virtues and Vices.
So what St. Augustine really, one of my favorite books, and to anyone who's watching, I would say read The City of God. It's one of my favorite books. What St. Augustine, the problem that he's dealing with at the time is the Vandals and the barbarians are starting to attack the Roman Empire. And what a lot of the Romans at the time were saying, the problem with the Roman Empire is it became Christian. That's why the Roman Empire fell. Or look at like these Christians, your God won't save you. Look, nuns are being attacked. Churches are being destroyed by the Goths and the Vandals. Where is your God? So what St. Augustine says in his City of God in chapter 1, he actually says, it's not what a man suffers, but how he suffers, whether he praises God or whether he blasphemes and curses God. That is how you know the true mark of a man, or how you know the true mark of a human person. No matter what befalls them, whether it's calamity, whether it's goodness, whether he offers that adoration to God and actually says, thank you, Lord, for the goodness. Thank you for the blessings. Thank you for whatever I've received. I offer it to you. So St. Augustine starts saying the tradition that the Stoics and the Greco-Romans have, that, we have to develop virtue. He's saying it's incomplete. You need Christ, because all your suffering is in vain unless it's in unity with the cross.
Yep.
And that's something that, again, in modern philosophy today, there's this rise of Nietzsche and this idea that, all that matters is the materialism and life is suffering. You just have to deal with it.
Yep.
They're not actually new. They're just, in a way, just representing what the
They're
Stoics...
regurgitating a lot of the old stuff that the Stoics already said.
Exactly. So, and then again, that hits on that Pelagianism, this idea that, you know what? Suffering merits nothing unless it's in conformity with Christ and his cross. And that's what Augustine really pushes forward. One of the many things that he pushes forward, which helps develop philosophy and theology, this idea of suffering. So when we link it back to Aristotle, it's this idea of fortitude, temperance, justice, prudence.
Yep.
Those things can only be perfected through Jesus Christ. Connecting that with St. Paul, he also says, although there are 4 cardinal virtues, 4 natural virtues that every human being can attain, there are 3 theological virtues that only can be infused by Jesus Christ. Yep. Faith, hope, and charity. And the greatest of these, obviously, is charity.
Okay. So when you're speaking about the infused virtues now, and you relate them to the cardinal virtues, why are they infused?
Okay. So the infused virtues are ones that can be attained. They're gratuitously given. They're given by God to the person.
Yep.
So faith, a lot of people have this really misinformed understanding of what faith is. People always say to me, even my students, I don't feel like when I go to church, I don't have this feeling.
Yep.
Faith
so
actually...
they associate faith with a feeling.
Exactly. They associate faith with an appetite.
Yep.
And that is disordered.
Yep.
Faith is an act of the intellect.
It is, yep.
Faith is when, by definition in the Council of Trent, when you subjugate or you submit your intellect to the truth, which is Jesus Christ and reality.
Yep.
That is faith. When you understand what the church teaches, yep, and you submit your intellect to it, even though you might not see it, even though you may not understand it completely, like the Trinity, for example,
yep,
you still subjugate your intellect to what the church teaches. That is faith. It's not an emotion.
Yeah.
So St. Thomas Aquinas says, if you conflate emotion with faith, that is incredibly disordered and leads to many problems.
So faith is also probably another easy way for our students to understand what faith is that faith is seeing without believing. It's believing without seeing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. So with Augustine, you mentioned the City of God, and we spoke about the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because as a Christian, I get a lot of arguments from atheists that how can you believe in a God because there's so much suffering in the world? It's almost like we can actually turn that on them. How can you endure suffering without a God to help you endure it? Like all the suffering and everything that you do in this world, everything that you need to go and endure, it's almost like you're doing it for no reason. It's like, as Christians, when we look at the cross and we look at sacrifice, it's almost like we have the end in goal. We have the end in mind. This virtue, this perfection that we need to, this perfection within us that we need to habituate, it's ordered towards a good end, because ultimately we want to be with Christ and we want to be in heaven with him. But for somebody who's an atheist, I don't understand how they would be able to explain pain and suffering?
Well, it's purely materialism. They're empirical. They believe, like you said, it's pure rationalism. So they would say there's no supernatural. All that matters is what's here in front of me. It's this immanentism, like we mentioned before. I'm the principle of judgment. What I see is reality. And again, it's unfortunate to say, but that's why we have such a rise of, suicide rates and euthanasia, because if suffering is pointless, and obviously as Christians we don't believe it's salvific, if suffering is pointless and life is pointless and has no telos, there's no final cause of life, because you're just a final product of millions and millions and billions of years of evolution from nothing, then what is the point of your existence? If you suffer, just end it. But that is a pathetic way to live when you really think about it, because you need to see the suffering. This is something I always say to my students, and I work at a boys' school, so my approach would be a little bit different. I would say to students, it's the suffering that makes you better. It's uniting your suffering to the cross, which makes you strong. For example, if I'm training, I'm not happy to just lift a little weight and say, look at me, I can do this 30 times. That's not impressive. What you should be saying is put more weight on, make it more difficult, because that's how you grow in physical strength. Similarly, the way you grow in spiritual strength is you are able to endure more suffering, and that's what God gives to his saints. Not implying that I'm a saint, but that's what God gives to his saints. You actually see the greatest saints are the ones who suffer most, because God says, how far can you go? How much are you willing to suffer for me? Because you look at the cross behind us, that's how far Christ is willing to go for us. So he's saying, will you do the same?
And are we going to be imitators of him?
Exactly.
Awesome. All right, so let's look at another Christian thinker now. So we've touched on Augustine. Now the big dog, Aquinas. So let's speak about St. Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, so St. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican. He's one of the greatest saints. He's one of my favorite saints. He is a doctor of the church, the angelic doctor. And he wrote a book called the Summa Theologiae. Many other books like the Summa Contra Gentiles. All these things deal with sacred scriptures. When you read one of my favorite encyclicals, Aeterni Patris, written by Pope Leo XIII, he says,
on the return to scholastic theology?
Exactly. And that's something that I completely agree with. I believe, like I said at the start of the show, the way that we're going to save the church is not by knowing these little tidbits, by arguing with people. The way we're going to save the church and preserve Christian civilization is through our families, by teaching them Thomistic principles and teaching them the faith. Because that's where they meet together. What Aeterni Patris says, which is a quote of Cajetan, he actually says the reason why St. Thomas Aquinas has the greatest theology, it does borrow the natural law. It uses Aristotle, he baptizes it, makes it perfect, and then actually merges that with the early church fathers. And because he so reverenced them, it's almost like he inherited the knowledge of all of them and reproduces them in just a systematic framework, which is just, as you read through it, many people who you would say suffer from the heresy of modernism, they don't like St. Thomas Aquinas because he's too systematic and there's no room to move things around because it's so clear.
They say that he's too rigid.
It's too rigid. But we would say the rigidity is what has definition. It's clear. It's a clear
It gives
faith.
us direction, and it's the truth.
Absolutely.
All right. So then when it comes to St. Thomas Aquinas would have been a disciple of Aristotle.
In a way, yes.
In a way.
Yes.
And he takes everything that's good in Aristotle. And when he was giving his lectures, I think in Italy, and I think even in Paris, I think a lot of the Christian thinkers at that time, or a lot of his, I don't think they liked him for it, because they kind of almost seemed that it was heretical to kind of bring in Greek philosophy and to try to make it Christian. But St. Thomas was the first, and it ended up working in his favor, I guess. But I don't know whether I think he had to defend himself within his own lifetime, but everybody appreciated, and even the Summa Theologiae or the Summa Theologica was considered the kind of like a foundational book of Christian catechism almost. It was like a foundational catechism. So when it comes to virtues and vices, what does St. Thomas Aquinas say?
So what St. Thomas Aquinas says, building on the tradition that he's already working in, is that sin, for example, sin is another word for vice, but in a supernatural context. And grace is a virtue, a supernatural virtue. I guess you could say it in that way. So what St. Thomas Aquinas says is the reason what sin does to us, it actually weakens the will and darkens the intellect. So when someone becomes habituated in sin by doing the wrong thing continuously, they're actually weakening their ability. They're dehumanizing themselves almost, because they're not living up to their potential. You're made in the image and likeness of God. By acting contrary to that, you're actually weakening your powers as a human person. That's why I would say people who are becoming disordered in the passions, for example, because they're operating according to their passions, they actually you could say they don't have the ability to actually ascertain what they're doing wrong because they have a hardness of heart. They're not actually able to see. Every time you sin, initially, for example, your intellect, because you have the natural law inside you, because you have a conscience inside you, because the 10 Commandments, as the Catechism teaches or as St. Paul teaches, is already within every single human person. That time you sin, you're actually committing a lie because you know what's right, but you're not doing it because you want to do what you want to do.
Yep.
So what St. Thomas Aquinas is saying, that first time you do it, you're injuring, you're weakening that will, because you're saying to the will, don't listen to this guy, don't listen to the intellect, turn it the other way, do what you want, turn it inward.
Yeah.
So what you're actually doing is you're becoming weaker, you're habituating that sin to the point where someone who is habituated over so long, they're not actually able to see where they're wrong. So when you're dealing with someone who is so far from the faith, who lives a life of vice, it's almost impossible without supernatural grace for you to reach that person because they're so habituated in what they've been doing.
That's funny though, because when you were speaking about with St. Thomas and with regards to virtues, so what I noticed that he takes from Aristotle and what he takes from Plato is this idea of the soul. And within the faculty of this soul, because Aristotle believed that souls, that vegetables have souls, or sorry, not vegetables, plants have souls, okay? Animals have souls and humans have souls. But the souls are different. There are things that are common in each, like for example, reproduction, life and growth. But then when you move on to animals and humans, there's locomotion, which is like movement, for example. So like animals can move, they can reproduce, okay, physically, and they've got like digestive systems and nervous systems. But humans have the ability to rationalize. Now, the difference between an animal and a human person is that within the soul of a human person, they have what's known as a rational appetite. Is that right? And within the rational appetite is another word for the will, which is what animals don't have. So with an animal, for example, an animal's passions or their appetites completely dictate them. Whereas with a person, their passions do not have the ability to dictate their reason. Okay? An animal is completely, their decisions are completely dictated by their passions. So for example, if you have an animal or like a bird, for example, or a fish, and you keep giving them food, they'll end up eating themselves to death. Like they'll die of overeating. Whereas a human being will be able to know, wait a second, I've eaten enough, I need to stop. So when it comes to Aquinas, he looks at the intellect and he looks at the will of a person. And with regards to the intellect, he goes, okay, what is the intellect ordered towards? And remember how you were saying that the intellect is ordered towards truth, okay? And you were saying about how sin is a darkening of the intellect. And so when it comes to the intellect, whenever the job of the intellect is to look at information, for example. So that, let's say, for example, when we look at, and the students would know this, especially the senior ones, like let's say smoking. The intellect is what processes that information. Smoking has got carcinogens in it. It's got chemicals. And then the will is the desire within the soul to either choose to smoke or not to smoke. And so the intellect presents the information to the will, and then the will chooses either to decide to actually make that decision or not to. So what happens is that when the sin is when either the intellect is darkened or when the will is weakened. And so that when the person knows that something is wrong, like let's say, for example, in a situation where you've got a husband and a wife and a man's married and he knows that he shouldn't be cheating on his wife and he sees another woman, if his will, his lust, his desire for another woman becomes so strong that it takes over, okay, like you were saying before about Plato, sin is like when the passions, they tell the will, which tells the intellect what to do. It kind of works in a reverse order. And it's when a person seeks an apparent good over the universal good. So the apparent good would be, and people seek apparent goods all the time because we're drawn to those. Our appetites are drawn towards goods. So even in the case of a man wanting to cheat on his wife, the reason why he does it is because he knows that the feeling that he's going to get from that sexual encounter is going to feel good, okay, which is the reason why he goes for it. But it's disordered. Why? Because he's married and he shouldn't be allowing his reason to be dictated by his passions. Absolutely. Did you want to add anything to that?
So one thing that, building on what you just said, which is really great, the idea is people think, for example, that's a personal sin, or for example, this vice, it's personal. For example, no one's going to say it's a private thing. But what St. Thomas Aquinas would say is no sin is ever private. Because when we look at Aristotle's four causes, what we believe from Aristotle and also which St. Thomas Aquinas uses is that God is the primary cause of all things. Okay, obviously there are secondary causes. You know, your parents brought you to an existence, but God obviously is the cause of, you know, all creation, for example.
Yep.
But the final cause, according to Christian theology and St. Thomas Aquinas, is to manifest God's glory and eventually be with him in heaven. Whenever you sin, you're detracting from God's glory that he has a right to, in accordance with justice, having created you. Being the Kyrios, or the Lord, or the Dominos of this world, he has authority over it. Because he's the Alpha and the Omega. He has authority over this earth, and you are detracting from his glory by doing an injustice towards him, by misusing yourself or another person, for example. So what he's saying is, you must manifest God's glory in all of your actions, and every single time you create an infraction against that law, there must be a repayment for that. And obviously that builds into the concept of reparation and purgatory in the Catholic theology. Yep. But you must make account for every single time you infract against his law.
Okay, so with St. Thomas, when it comes to virtues and vices as well, was there anything else that you wanted to touch on with regards to virtues and vices, or did you want to now go on to the telos of the individual, which is happiness and God being the last end? Did you want to speak about anything to do with that?
So we can move on to telos and the last end of the human person.
Okay, yep. So let's move on to the telos. So what did you want to say about telos?
So again, using St. Thomas Aquinas' principle of telos, or teleology, we would say, is that the telos of the human person, for example, a human person, the material cause would be the genetic makeup, for example.
Yep.
Okay? The physical biology of the person, the bones, the genetics, the muscles, that is the material cause of the person.
Yep.
The formal cause, you have a human soul. That's why you're a human.
Yep.
That's why, as you were saying before, that's what makes a human different from an ape,
yep,
from a cat, from a dog. You have the form of a human,
yep,
with your human soul.
And also the form of the body is the way that we look.
The soul informs the actual body.
Yep.
So what, and the other thing that St. Thomas Aquinas would say, carrying on what you just said, is the body actually, it actually changes itself or realigns itself in congruity with the operations of the soul.
Okay.
I mean, if you're habituating vices in you, your body, your makeup actually changes to be more predisposed to that.
Towards sin?
Towards sin.
Okay.
So you have the form of a human person. You have the soul of a human person.
Yep.
Who is the efficient cause of you? The primary efficient cause is obviously God. Yep. But your parents are the efficient cause of you. They made you.
Yep.
And the final cause, only God can create that final cause.
Yep.
The final cause of every human person is to attain virtue, to manifest God's glory, and also to be with him in eternal beatitude in heaven.
Okay, and that's the telos. And so when it comes to our soul, all of our actions, because ultimately, when it comes to the moral choices that a person makes, every moral choice that a person makes is either good or it's bad. And there are conditions. Did you want to speak about the fonts of morality, for example, with regards to an action? So what makes an action good?
So in order to put it very simply, considering the audience, you don't want to get too technical because there's some things in Aquinas that are very deep theologically and philosophically. But what he would say is, in order for an act to, it depends on intention.
Yep.
So if you have the intention and the matter, if what you're doing, you have the intention to do evil, the act becomes evil.
Yep.
If you have the intention to good, the act becomes good.
Yep.
Some acts, I guess, could be neutral. For example, me, drinking a cup of water,
yep.
But everything ultimately either leads to your betterment to grace and virtue,
yep,
or it leads to vice, yep, and sin, I guess. And ultimately, sin is from a Catholic perspective, sin is detracting or acting against God's supernatural revelation.
Yeah.
There are a set of laws or principles,
yep,
but I would argue they're also in conformity with natural laws. So
yep,
one thing all my students always ask me, so why are you a Catholic? Have you looked into other religions? I've looked into them briefly, I've read into them,
yep,
but when it really comes down to it, I always find whatever religion it is, they don't conform to natural law. There's always something that's missing and it doesn't make sense. And if God created natural law and the way it works, his supernatural law would complement it.
Yep.
Catholicism perfectly complements the natural law, and it perfects it. It supernaturalizes it and makes it better.
Can you give an example of that? Like, let's say marriage, for example.
Okay, so the bond of marriage,
Yep.
from a purely secular point of view, is just the unity between two people, two
Yep.
persons now in this current climate.
Yep.
Two persons, two consenting persons
Yep.
who want to be in a union.
Yep.
Okay? According to the definition of the law. Marriage is actually a covenant.
Yep.
From a supernatural perspective. Not only are you joining in a union, you're actually inviting God into this through his blessing, and he's actually creating a covenant between the man and the woman, a supernatural bond of love.
Yep.
And it supernaturalizes it. It takes that natural institution, I guess you could say, of marriage, and it makes it even more powerful. It adds supernatural grace and virtue into that marriage.
And how would, and because the audience would be wondering, well, okay, well, how does that conform, marriage according to the Christian way, conform to the natural law? So from a Catholic perspective, how would one man and one woman, how would their marriage conform to the natural law?
That's an excellent question.
Go for it.
Using Aristotle's principles.
Yep.
What is the telos of a marriage? According to the Catholic teaching, according to the natural law, is the procreation and generation of children.
Yep.
Any marriage that cannot do that, according to Aristotle, is a disordered marriage.
And therefore it doesn't conform to the natural law.
Absolutely.
So if there's any religion or any way of thinking that doesn't conform to the telos of the human person, then automatically we know that that's disordered.
Absolutely.
Okay, and so touching upon what you were saying earlier, if there are laws within a society that are conformed to the appetites and don't conform to right reason, I think St. Thomas even says that they become unjust and we have a duty not to follow them.
That's St. Thomas Aquinas says it, but it's actually from St. Augustine. He says an unjust law is no law at all.
Is no law at all.
It's actually from the Tractates of St. John. So he actually says, as in accordance with justice, because remember, it's getting deep now.
Yeah.
So when we look at Aristotle and the natural law, we look at something like justice, for example.
Yep.
Justice is to render every man his right. St. Thomas Aquinas and the Christian tradition is to render God and every man his right. Like charity, people think charity is like, oh, you're homeless, here's some money. Charity is actually
love of God first.
Love of God and then neighbor for the sake of God.
For the sake of God.
Okay, and the word is agape or caritas.
Yeah, true caritas.
Exactly. People think it's charity is, here's $5 for a homeless guy, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's not actually the definition of it.
That's not true caritas.
So justice, by definition, is to God first. So the idea of the Stoic tradition, so even Marcus Aurelius, even Marcus Tullius Cicero, they will even say an unjust law that's imposed upon a population that's unjust, you have a moral obligation
not to follow it.
Not to follow that law.
Origen quotes Cicero when he was actually speaking about the natural law, because he says that that when laws do not conform to the natural law, then Christians, as a duty, as citizens, have a right to disobey.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. Was there anything else that you wanted to touch on with that?
Well, when it comes to the justice, when it comes to laws and government, what one of the big proponents of that, you'd have Seneca, and you'd also have Marcus Tullius Cicero, and even Plato talks about it. But the idea is that the purpose of the government, for example, whether that's a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy, or a mixed government, which is a combination of all three, which St. Thomas Aquinas believes is the best form of government. The purpose of a government is to facilitate the common good of the people. And the common good, people have this misconception that, in a multicultural, multi-religious society, we can all kind of work together and we can kind of make a good society. I would say that's philosophically flawed. Because when you really think about it, Jesus Christ is the Prince of Peace. And the only way you can have a good society is if it conforms to virtue. So how can some people who don't conform to virtue and people who do form a true congruity in society? You can't, because they're diametrically opposed in what they believe. So some people believe, for example, abortion is lawful. Some people do not believe that. There can never be a unity in that, because that's something that both sides, both principles will never agree on. The purpose of a government is to facilitate the natural law. Okay.
And the laws that they pass, because a law, according to St. Thomas, is a promulgated order of reason. Which is interesting, because promulgated means that it's written down, but laws need to be based upon an order of reason, which means that they need to make sense and they need to be teachable. So if you look at any law, for example, and if a law doesn't conform to reason, then it doesn't make sense, and then it's an unjust law.
Absolutely.
And so there are so many things that we can talk about with regards to that. And that's I'm not
supporting a revolution against the government or anything, but these are just some principles that are raised.
No, but that's true. And I think that a lot of students, they don't stop and they think about that. Because a lot of the time when I get asked by students about certain questions, I always ask them, okay, well, if you look at, for example, like a hot topic, for example, now is same-sex marriage, for example. If you look at same-sex marriage, it's a law that's been passed, right?
Yep.
But if you look at what the definition of a law is it based on an order of reason? And so when you look at the telos, the end, you look at the essence and the nature of people, human persons, and you look at their faculties, their reproductive faculties, and you see that they're directed towards certain ends. Okay, the reason why laws are promulgated in order to regulate marriages is because they protect these institutions, because they serve the common good, because families produce children. Children become the citizens of societies. And if these children are raised in protected, conducive environments, they become good citizens and then they contribute to society. And the funny thing about that is St. Thomas Aquinas, that one of his principles of natural inclination, the third one, is that everybody has a right to be ordered towards the truth, to be able to be educated, which comes from the second principle, because parents have the right to not only educate their children, but they also have the right, they have the right to raise their children, but to educate them. But along with the third is that everyone has a right to live in society, to seek truth, and to contribute to society as well. And so when we look at those principles, for example, and we look at the fact that human persons, okay, have got a certain telos about them. They're ordered towards a certain end. Their reproductive faculties. As soon as you're saying that something else other than a man and a woman, okay, as soon as you're going to say that that's a marriage, you're going to say, okay, well, let's have a look at that. Can those two people complement each other? And are their bodies together ordered towards the single end of procreation? If it's not, then that law doesn't make sense. It's not based on an order of reason, and it's either unjust or it's corrupt.
Absolutely.
What would you say to that?
Look, I think you hit the nail on the head. When you really think about it, when it comes to marriage, for example, one of the problems with that was the redefinition, I guess you could say, in catechisms, I guess you could say, whereas in traditional catechisms, it would say something like the purpose of marriage is the procreation and generation of children.
Yep.
And then as a secondary cause is the mutual love and affection of the
unity
partners.
of the spouses.
Whereas now they are both the same, or one is superior to the other. It's for the mutual love of the partners, and then the procreation of children. Because when you really think about it, regardless of if we can get into caritas and agape and true love, if we can really get into that, that's a question for another day. But really, when you think about it, on a very superficial level, you can say, for example, that a same-sex couple love each other, I guess in a natural way. So if the purpose of marriage is love, why can't they get married? But it's not. Because you've inverted the principles. And that's something St. Thomas Aquinas is really big on. If you don't have a principled society, if you're not a principled person, you will fall for anything because you don't understand the telos of things around you. You must understand the purpose and the finality of things around you. If you don't, you have a very relativistic, immanentist principle of reality. You think whatever I think is the principle of judgment. How do I feel today? That is the way it is. How do I feel about you? That's the way it is. How do I feel about, laws of a natural law and principles about morality and justice? Whatever I think. You're a flawed human being. You don't have an infallible mind. How do you know what is the reality of things? In order to live a virtuous life, you must have a congruence. You must have a connection between what St. Thomas Aquinas says, what is truth? Truth is when you see what something is and your conception of what that is in direct proportion to what it actually is. And you don't see it greater or lesser than what it is. You have an absolute understanding of what it is.
And it's almost like when you were speaking before about Aristotle and about the virtues and that prudence and that being able to regulate everything and to be able to see the truth and to be able to conform your, your understanding, to conform that to reality. Okay, I guess that's what truth actually is to be able to conform yourself to reality. And that's like when we get into even other topics about, like, for example, transgenderism, or if we look at abortion, for example, it's interesting that people aren't consistent with their arguments. So like when we look at, for example, abortion, some people might make the argument that that's not a human person. But when we look at Aristotelian metaphysics, for example, we looked at actuality and potency, well, what makes it not a human person? Is it because it can't think? but that does it have the potential to think? So if you're saying that it can't think or it doesn't have the ability to speak, what about a person who's in a coma or a person that's sleeping? Okay, it's almost that you can make the connection with the unborn. You can do that with some person who's living within reality. Okay, and as soon as people start to realize that just because a baby within the womb, for example, doesn't have the ability to verbalize, doesn't have the capacity at the moment to actualize thought processes or senses or so on and so forth, just because of that, it doesn't mean that it's not there in potentia or in potentiality. So they're still human persons. And as soon as people have lost that understanding, that basic understanding of metaphysics, they're able to go and make irrational decisions and conclusions to go and say that's not a baby. But then they can go and say, well, we found water on Mars and that's life. They can't. They just make some really weird connections.
It's an inconsistency. So one thing that you'll find as a teacher, you'll see this all the time. Firstly, people, what they like to do is they set up red herrings everywhere. They set up little scarecrow arguments, and they'll say, defend this point. You answer it. Okay, now defend this point. You answer it. Now defend this point. They just keep moving the goalposts.
They do that all the time.
All the time.
Yeah.
Some people, they're not ready to they don't actually want to know the truth.
Yeah.
Because this is something that we were speaking about earlier, but it really comes down to this. The reason why, in my personal experience, obviously as a teacher, as a 30-year-old man, obviously relatively young, the reason why people don't come to accept Jesus Christ, and this is based on my own experience, is because people don't want to change.
Yep.
Because in order for them to actually accept Jesus Christ, in order for them to live a virtuous life even, it means there are some things about their life that they have to change. They have to accept, in accordance with truth, see things for what they are, not greater or less, a direct proportionality. Is what I'm doing wrong? But they don't want to ask that question because that's hard. And I'm sorry to say it, people today are cowards.
Yep.
They don't have that virtue of fortitude. They're not able to withstand what's difficult.
Yep.
They don't want to say, watching pornography is easy, I'd rather do that.
Yep.
They don't want to change because that's difficult.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to accept Catholicism. They don't want to accept the truth because then that means they have to change 15, 20 things about their life that they like because they've developed this disorder, this habituation with sin. What they've actually told their bodies is, for decades, is almost, this is the way we operate. We operate in an inversion. This is the way we do things now. If you're telling me I have to accept Jesus Christ, you mean to tell me I have to switch this around? I'm not doing that.
Well, that's interesting though, because there was a philosopher by the name of Freud, and Freud said that that ultimately, whatever you derive the most pleasure from, that's how you can form your. That's where you can form your life. Wherever you derive the most pleasure
Hedonism.
from. It's like a form of hedonism. You're right. And so people these days, what they'll do is they'll say, okay, it's all about pleasure. I need to be able to derive pleasure in any way possible from any individual, collective, or whatever it is. And that if that's not giving me pleasure, then I am not going to conform my truth or my reality to that. And I think so when you speak about, for example, whether it be students or people, for example, that might have certain addictions, whether it be pornography or whether it be even gaming addictions, when they realize that they need to actually give that up, they realize that they would rather adopt a mentality where they don't have to give that up, okay, rather than detach themselves from those pleasures or that sin, because ultimately, and St Augustine I think says this as well, he says that sin is when you worship the creature over and above the creator. And so the creature could be anything from pornography to gambling to sloth, whether it be sleeping in and not wanting to go out and do anything and help anyone with anything.
Yep.
It could be anything. You know what I mean? And so as soon as people decide to worship the creature and not the creator, they seek the apparent good over the universal good. They conform their life to falsities, an error rather than truth. That's ultimately what sin is. And I think that's what Aristotle, just to get back onto, to St. Thomas Aquinas, that's what St. Thomas Aquinas is ultimately saying. He says that everybody's lives is ordered towards happiness. It's ordered towards truth. It's ordered towards goodness. And who is God? God is the truth. God is goodness itself. God is what's going to ultimately make somebody happy. And when a person orders their life towards something that's an apparent good, they're not ordering their lives and their end towards God. And so that at the end, when they die and their soul is separated from their body, God actually gives them what they want. And if they didn't desire him in this life, they're not going to desire him in the next.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Absolutely. Because when you really think about it, when in the gospel, Jesus Christ even says Satan is the father of lies, and Jesus Christ is the truth, and the Father is the truth, and he and the Father are one. So what you really look at is this, if you take it from a more spiritual perspective, the way that, I guess you could say, temptation happens is every single person, based on their predisposition, based on the way they've habituated themselves over time, there are certain weaknesses that you have that are particular to you as an individual. I have my own, you have your own, everyone has their own particular weaknesses. And they might be different. And the differences. Thanks be to God, I don't have a problem with drinking, for example. Okay? There's bottles of wine and, scotch that have been in my house that I've never even opened. But for someone else, that's a massive problem because that's the way that they've habituated themselves. They lack the virtue of temperance. So they can, it's funny, when I was in confession once, one of the priests actually said to me, if you're saying something like, I talk too much, I swore a few times, I gossiped, these are my 3 sins. The priest actually said to me, a good FSSP priest, he actually said to me, that's actually 1 sin. When you really think about it, you lack moderation, you lack temperance. You don't know how to control when things need to be said or when things need to be done. So, for example, that man who suffers from alcoholism, for example, he lacks that ability.
The virtue of temperance?
He lacks the virtue of temperance. So you'll find that the students, for example, have a problem with pornography, have a problem with gaming, are on their phone too much. They lack temperance in general, and it affects every single sub-virtue that goes under that. So what temptation is, or what the demonic forces, I guess you could say, do is they find the chinks in your armor and they go after that in particular, and they exacerbate that one thing, and they know that's what's going to get you, and that's what they're going to hit you with. So they keep going at it until you fall and until you break. And again, the thing that we believe about Catholicism is that Jesus Christ, and through prayer and through the sacraments, it fortifies you. Supernatural fortification. It boosts you up so that you can repel and you can withstand the onslaughts of temptation.
Okay, awesome. So now, to end this then, we're speaking about virtues, we're speaking about vices. We've spoken about Aristotle, we've spoken about the Christian thinkers, we spoke about the Greeks and so on and so forth. So to conclude, let's speak about our Lord, and how His grace is able to help the human person perfect these virtues. So did you want to speak about how our Lord perfects them, like whether it be through the sacraments? Go for it.
Okay, so firstly, one thing that we all have as part of the virtue of piety towards God and the virtue of justice is prayer. That's the first thing. What we believe about the sacraments is, see how we talk about these things like the natural virtues? They only get you so far. You need supernatural grace in order to save you, because I know it's politically incorrect to say this, but good people don't go to heaven, holy people go to heaven. And anyone who is saved outside of the church is through the grace of the sacraments that the Catholic Church dispenses through the world. So it subsists entirely in the Catholic Church, and then by cooperation with that, that's how people are saved. Okay? So what we believe about the sacraments is this. In order to... the first step is obviously baptism. So we believe that you are in a state of concupiscence, as St. Thomas Aquinas would say. Just by the state of original sin is that you already have a predisposition to do what's wrong.
And it's when your passions, they pretty much they dictate your will and your reason.
Exactly. A person will naturally want to do what's easier and I guess what's vicious. So for example, if you said to me, hey, can you please go to work today, get $300 for the day for a whole day's work? Okay. Or you could stay home and do nothing, I'll give you $300. Obviously, I'm going to choose the second one because we have a predisposition to, I guess,
to be lazy and stay home. And St. Paul talks about the war between the soul and the body, between the law that's written upon the heart. He speaks about it in Romans 1, but he speaks about this war that occurs between his spirit and between his body. He goes, the good that I want to do, I don't do. But the good that I know that I'm supposed to do, I don't do. I'm always getting it wrong. I think it's in Romans 8.
The one of my favorite verses, and I'll piggyback of what you just said. It's he restates it in Hebrews 12. He actually says, the first part isn't. He says, I subjugate my body and bring it into subjection. This idea that the way that you perfect yourself, St. Augustine says this in the City of God. You're almost like if you've ever seen gold when it's first taken out of a mountain or a quarry, for example, it's got imperfections in it, lumps. And it's in lumps. There's bits of imperfections inside it. The only way you purify gold is through striking it. You chastise it, you smash it, you hit it, you burn it, And through that process, that purgation, that's what makes it pure gold. And that's what makes it strong. That's what makes it vibrant. That's what makes it beautiful. That's why gold is so expensive, because the process is so hard. That's what we believe about the human person. You chastise yourself and bring it into subjection. So someone, for example, who doesn't have the natural virtue of moderation can never develop their supernatural virtue of fasting, for example, or prayer, because prayer is hard. People think, I'm going to pray, it feels good, Jesus loves me, yay, I have this feeling. That's nothing, that's not what it is.
And that's not what prayer is, no.
Prayer is when you're actually in communication with God and you're saying, I'm offering you adoration and worship, and I'm subjugating my will and my intellect to you because you are the supreme truth. And because of that, the communication is that you are actually changing yourself and you're more conforming yourself to Him. Because ultimately, again, politically incorrect, but the people who are saved are those who most resemble Christ. God ultimately loves Himself because He is supremely good. And then obviously He loves the Blessed Virgin Mary because through her perfection, she most reflects God. That's why we regard her as the greatest of all creatures. God loves us insofar as we imitate His Son. Jesus Christ is a holy and virtuous person. If you do not have those qualities, ultimately God's favor is not with you because you don't reflect that. Because God ultimately wants what reflects Himself.
And He loves what He sees in Himself in other people.
Exactly, and that's what we believe grace is. Grace is the indwelling of the triune God within
the Holy
you.
Spirit within us.
And so again, that's what we believe. And the supreme thing, I guess we can end on this, I guess, is the greatest sacrament obviously is communion. So communion obviously is when we actually partake in the heavenly mystery, in the divine banquet, in the revelation, when we actually are with the slain lamb and we actually partake in that. And in that communion, we are actually that God that Aristotle and Plato said was up in the sky, this form up in the sky, this omnipotent God, He's actually incarnating, He's actually coming down, He's actually transcending. He's coming down to us and He's allowing us through His infinite love to actually be one with Him. And you must have that. You must have that communion with God. You must have that unity with God. One thing that a lot of students ask me is, why do you know that Catholicism is the true religion? This is something I wanted to bring up earlier, but I thought it would make it a bit too long. When you look at the Old Testament, for example, there's blood sacrifices. You have to have a sacrifice. In order to appease God, there must be a sacrifice. Judaism does not have a sacrifice. Their temple is destroyed. Okay? And one other fact about that is the Jews still are waiting for their Messiah. We obviously believe that is Jesus Christ. They're waiting for that Messiah to come to save them. When you read someone like Eusebius or Flavius Josephus, they actually said that in order to subjugate the Jews because of their rebellions, Vespasian, the emperor of Rome, actually found every single descendant of King David and killed them all in order to spite the Jews that their Messiah would never come back. That's a bit excessive, but that's something that's not only is your temple gone, your priesthood is gone, your sacrifice is gone, your Davidic line is gone. And the Jews rejected Christ because they wanted a king like King David. But He says to them, you have someone greater than Solomon in front of you. And that ties back to what you were saying before. We see all these literary comparisons. We see all these foreshadowing in the Old and the New Testament. They were expecting a conqueror to come to destroy the Roman Empire. But he offered them wisdom like Solomon. He offered them truth. So what we believe as Christians is that we need that sacrifice to appease God, and we need to be in communion with Him. That the only religion that continues that sacrifice from the beginning of time, from Adam to now, is the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That's what we believe.
Awesome. And also with regards to the Eucharist, because you're speaking about the Eucharist sanctifies the soul, and it has the ability to perfect the virtues, doesn't it?
Yes, so it fortifies the will. It actually increases your strength with a supernatural, like a supernatural energy. It fortifies you, makes you more able to withstand the onslaughts of the world. And it sharpens or it enlightens the intellect. So what you could say, there's a direct correlation between someone's level of grace and their virtue and how they are as a person.
Awesome. So just to end this then, that must mean then that when Christ gives us the sacraments are meant to, or the grace is that supernatural help that God gives us, okay, in order to be able to conform the intellect to the will to perfect virtue so that we can become good people and get to heaven.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, Daniel.
Been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. We're gonna definitely have you back on. Guys, that was another episode of Couch Catechism. I'm your host, Michael Obeid. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned, keep the faith, and we'll see you next time.
Hi, I'm Father Daniel Russo, and I'm here with the team of Veraces Media. What's fantastic about this initiative is that it's an Australian-based catechetical resource. In other words, it's our Catholics right here at home who are teaching us about Jesus Christ in an uncompromised way. We're learning the fullness of the truth and nothing less. We're also supporting our local priests, nuns, and laymen and women, and empowering them to be educators in the faith, to be evangelizers. So by supporting this initiative, you're supporting the church in our country. So get on board and support Veraces Media.